Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Mamp, and I'm really pleased to present my research to you about Charles Pierce. This is a presentation entitled Fashioning a Male Actress, Charles Pierce. I'm going to start with this quote from Charles. You've heard of women's wear daily. This is what men wear nightly. Charles Pierce was a prominent female impersonator of the mid to late 20th century who gained great acclaim. Although names like RuPaul may currently be household names, long before there was RuPaul, there were many other men who performed in drag professionally and gained popularity and success, one of those being Charles Pierce. What you see here in this slide are images of Charles Pierce on the left doing his impersonation of Bette Davis, also dressed as Bette Davis on the right. And in the center, in the Harvey Fierstein film, Torch Song Trilogy, which was one of his last major performances of the late 1980s. But in this presentation, I'm going to take you through the history of Charles Pierce and give you a bit of insight into his experiences in fashioning himself within his profession of a female impersonator. So I wanted to share with you some of the methods as well as the sources that I utilized to complete this research. So overall, this research is grounded in the historic method and also utilizes oral history. I was very fortunate to find a former costume designer that worked with Charles and interviewed that designer as a part of this research. Very uniquely, this research includes artifact analysis. Museums and archives have few examples of representation of drag or female impersonation. And in a broader context, queer identity is oftentimes negated or erased within archives or museum settings. So this research specifically benefited from surviving personal papers, ephemera, and costumes that belong to Charles Pierce. Both at the One Archives at the University of Southern California Libraries, the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives, as well as at the Billy Rose Theater Division of the New York Library for the Performing Arts. And to analyze the extant or surviving garments that I viewed, I utilized a variety of material culture analysis tools that I combined together to create my own tool. Borrowing from Prown, Farrell Beck, as well as Pedersen. And then my sources included, obviously, material culture, the extant costumes of Pierce, as well as all of his personal papers, ephemera, photographs, this all existing in these two archives that I've mentioned. I've listed oral history here as a source as well, because before Pierce passed away, he was interviewed, and that interview was transcribed as an oral history at Southern Methodist University. Also, a variety of digital databases of newspapers and magazines informed my research. And fortunately, there's been a resurgence in recent years of Pierce's performances being posted on YouTube. So I was able to specifically refer to those performances as a part of my research as well. And finally, in terms of context, this research is really grounded in queer theory. So queer theory as a theoretical framework helps us to explore ways of rejecting binary concepts of gender. Pierce's moniker that he created for himself of male actress, he didn't really prefer to be called a drag queen or a female impersonator. He liked being called a male actress. Really is evidence of his ability at the time, which was way ahead of its time, to think outside of binary constructs of gender. Queer theory rejects binary concepts of gender and constructs of gender, and therefore Pierce's approach to this creation of male actress as a moniker was very much an act of queer activism. Queer theory also embraces spectrums of sexualities. Unlike many other professional female impersonators of the period, Charles Pierce was very open about his sexuality as a gay man. Queer theory also helps us to understand that no gender identity or sexual orientation is normal or deviant. It really rejects this heteronormative idea and cisgender concept that, there's one way and another way, that there are many different ways for people to express themselves related to gender and sexuality. And overall, queer theory challenges norms and hence the patriarchy. Pierce's career success, particularly post-Stonewall, is evidence to his challenging of the mainstream status quo. So queer theory was the theoretical framework that I used as I thought about Pierce's history and also as I analyzed his experiences and his extant costumes. So Charles Pierce was born in Watertown, New York in 1926, where early on he expressed a proclivity for cross-dressing. His aunt had been a performer in vaudeville, and in his grandmother's house, there were trunks up in the attic that included many of the costumes that she had worn in vaudeville. Very early on, as seen here at about the age of 8, Charles Pierce began to experiment with cross-dressing. These are examples of him dressing up as one of his favorite actresses, who was very popular during the interwar period, an actress by the name of Mae West. And this was his Halloween costume when he was around 8 years old that he wore for Halloween and also wore to school that day. By the age of 16, he had secured employment while going to high school simultaneously, working as an announcer and disc jockey at his local radio station. So he caught the bug for performance early on, which led him after high school to enroll in the theater arts program at the Pasadena Playhouse, located in Altadena, California, not far from Los Angeles. In the mid-1940s, the Pasadena Playhouse had become one of the most prestigious theater schools and companies in the country. Many young actors, directors, costume designers gained their training at the Pasadena Playhouse. These are images. Pierce began going to school at the Pasadena Playhouse to study theater, where he was trained in a wide variety of theater arts. Acting, he was an acting major, but they also had to learn set design and costuming and makeup and fencing and movement. It was a very comprehensive course of study. This is Pierce pictured here, hamming it up with some of his classmates. And then also pictured here on the left with Yusef Chahine, who is significant. This is Yusef Chahine here, who went on to be one of the most widely regarded, sort of the Steven Spielberg of the Middle Eastern world. And Yusef Chahine's films often addressed topics related to sexuality, particularly homosexuality and bisexuality. At the Playhouse, one of the things that Pierce came into contact with was puppetry. He and a group of his fellow classmates, this is Pierce again here, pictured with his classmates, and then obviously in the image on the left, they formed a small troupe that they called the Patio Puppeteers, where they learned how to make their own puppets and then also how to be marionettists and perform with the puppets. And they used a little patio that was adjacent to the Playhouse, hence they were called the Patio Puppeteers. This experience of making and working with puppets would be really important to Pierce later on when he was looking for ways to circumvent sumptuary laws that made cross-dressing illegal. So it was at the Playhouse that Pierce had his first experience with puppetry. Once he graduated from the Playhouse, he looked around and was trying to find a way to break into an acting career. He made the rounds in New York City somewhat unsuccessfully, but was really intrigued by the performances of another female impersonator who preceded him by the name of Arthur Blake. Arthur Blake in the 1930s and 40s was a famous female impersonator who often performed in nightclubs and was known in particular for doing a great impersonation of Bette Davis. If you Google Arthur Blake, you'll be able to go to a website called queermusicheritage.com. And there you'll find some ephemera related to Blake's history. And also his impersonation of Bette Davis was recorded and sold on vinyl. But the way that Blake performed is what you see in this image. He wore, man's tuxedo that he then layered woman's accessories on top of in order to execute the impression. This was in part due to sumptuary laws that made it illegal for someone to cross-dress. So police would often raid places like underground gay bars, and people could get arrested, as we'll talk more about, if they were caught cross-dressing. So female impersonators of the early and mid 20th century oftentimes worked in this way that you see Blake doing, where they layered woman's accessories on top of a man's tuxedo or a man's dinner jacket. This is very much in line. If you want to learn more about the history of female impersonation, I would strongly encourage you to read Esther Newton's seminal work, Mother Camp. Esther Newton was an anthropologist who worked in the field. And according to Newton, this form of layering woman's accessories on top of men's clothing was a typical way that female impersonators performed during this time. So Pierce was inspired by this, by the work of Arthur Blake, and began to work up a routine of his own where he did impersonations. But it's important to understand also within context that there wasn't just RuPaul, there was Charles Pierce, then there wasn't just Charles Pierce, there was Arthur Blake. And before there was Arthur Blake, there was Julian ELTINGE. In vaudeville of the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly during the Prohibition era, vaudeville was the main form of entertainment in the United States. Almost every major town had a vaudeville theater, and these vaudeville acts often included lots of different performers, kiddie acts, jugglers, singers, dancers, and oftentimes female impersonators. One of the most famous, and there were many, many female impersonators of the vaudeville period, but one of the most famous female impersonators of the vaudeville period was Julian ELTINGE, pictured here, dressed in men's clothing in the center, and then dressed in very typical Edwardian early 20th century styles that reflected the aesthetic of the Gibson girl in the early 20th century. So it's interesting that during vaudeville, these female impersonators did dress in full female clothing and full woman's clothing as a part of their acts. But by the time we got to Arthur Blake and to Charles Pierce in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and in particular post-war America, the social restrictions around cross-dressing became tighter than they were during the interwar period between World War I and World War II. So first of all, before we get to Club Echo in 1954, it's important for you to know that in 1952, inspired by Arthur Blake, Charles Pierce got his first gig as a professional performer, performing at Café La Vie, a play on the life, meaning the homosexual life, Café La Vie in a bar that was near Los Angeles, where he did impressions. And one Halloween night, just as the clock struck midnight, transitioning to November 1st, the police raided Café La Vie, and it was a deliberative sting because there was a loophole in the sumptuary law that made it okay to cross-dress on Halloween. But as soon as the clock struck midnight and it was no longer Halloween, it was the next day, they raided the bar where there were several performers dressed in women's clothes, but also some men who had come to the bar for Halloween who were cross-dressed. About 6 people were arrested. Their names were published in the Los Angeles Times as a means of public shaming. At least one of them was a teacher who lost his job, and Charles Pierce was working that night. He was dressed in a toga that said, "Eat at Caesar's" in red sequins on the back of the toga, and the police thought that this toga wasn't woman's clothing. So he wasn't arrested on that night, but it stuck with him. So he really took his cues initially from Arthur Blake when he experienced more bookings with his career. The first of which came in 1954 at Club Echo in Miami Beach. And you see Charles pictured here out in front of the club dressed in his tuxedo. And he worked at Club Echo very much in the way that Arthur Blake worked, where he would wear a tuxedo and he would layer woman's accessories one over top of the other to create the illusion of a female impression. At Club Echo, he met his performance and personal partner, Rio Dante. They were together for quite some time. And Rio Dante, who's pictured here on the left, would accompany Pierce on the piano and also work with him in various sketches as a part of their nightclub act that they performed at Club Echo in the mid-1950s. One of the things that Rio Dante and Charles Pierce did together as they were continually looking for ways to get around these restrictions related to cross-dressing was they created a set of puppets that they called les Mappettes. And these puppets were 3 to 4 foot tall puppets that the wearer, the performer, would strap to their body with a belt around the waist, and it had a big hook that attached to something else at the neckline. And they would rest their head on the top of the puppet and then manipulate the arms of the puppet. And so they only had to put on a hat or a wig and a little bit of makeup in order to create the illusion of a female impression using les Mappettes. The Mappettes were extremely successful throughout the late 50s and into the early 60s, and Pierce and Dante were booked regularly to perform their les Mappettes routine at about $600 a week, which was a substantial sum at the time. Luckily, a couple of les Mappettes survive at the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives at the University of Southern California, and that's what you see here on the screen. In the top row, first of all, is an image of Pierce with the Bette Davis Mappette. So he has his head positioned on the top of it. And then you can see the surviving extant example of the Bette Davis Mappette. And it also had this red holiday dress that it could change into for a holiday show. And then here again is Pierce with the Mae West Mappette, the extant Mappette, and another gown that survives for that Mappette as well, that the Mappette could be changed into. And then finally here on the right, this is me working with the artifacts in the archive, so you get a sense of their scale. Again, about somewhere between 3 and 4 foot tall. The performer would be dressed all in black, just placing their head on top of the puppet body, manipulating the arms and maybe putting on a little makeup, wig, or some other headwear in order to create the impression. So this was a really clever way to continue to challenge the patriarchy, to think about expressions of gender in a way that was beyond the binary, a man performing an impression of a woman, but very cleverly done as a way to avoid arrest. So by the early 1960s, Pierce and Rio Dante had relocated to San Francisco, California, which was a very gay-friendly town for the time, still is today. And they started working at a bar, a gay bar, in a district of San Francisco referred to as the Tenderloin, which was remains sort of a gay area of San Francisco, at a bar called the Gilded Cage. And it was here in gay-friendly San Francisco in the early to mid-1960s that Pierce began to finally dress in full drag. And his early drag was really comprised, and this is an example of Pierce's early form of drag. His early drag was really comprised of garments that he would purchase at secondhand stores or thrift stores and put together to create a look. So he really moved into full drag when he was working at the Gilded Cage in San Francisco in the 1960s. But it was also at the Gilded Cage that he began to costume his impressions, particularly of famous actresses, in much more elaborate ways. His most famous impression that he executed while working at the Gilded Cage, and he had a very long run throughout the 60s at the Gilded Cage, was that of Jeanette MacDonald. Jeanette MacDonald was a very famous Hollywood actress, particularly of the 1930s and 40s, and she starred in a film called San Francisco. that was about the San Francisco earthquake of the early 20th century. So Charles did an impression of Jeanette MacDonald where he lip-synced also the song San Francisco that she sang in the movie. And this is a typical costume that he wore while completing the Jeanette MacDonald impersonation. This particular impersonation, which was always how he closed his act in San Francisco because it was a crowd favorite, included this swing that would come down from the ceiling. A bubble machine would start making bubbles, and the swing would start going out across the audience and turn, and he would be lip syncing, and the swing would be going, and people would be ducking and roaring and just having a really great time. You can see here that one of the surviving artifacts of his Jeanette MacDonald costume is this parasol, which I had an opportunity to view also at the One Archives at the University of Southern California. So from Jeanette MacDonald, Pierce began to develop other fully costumed female impressions. Some of his most famous were Katharine Hepburn, here on the left. This is him as Mae West. You can see a similar costume as to what the mopette wore when he impersonated Mae West using the mopette. And then also Tallulah Bankhead, which oftentimes wore the same clothing that his Bette Davis impersonation did, but just had very different gestures and mannerisms and vocal pattern that allowed for the impression of Tallulah Bankhead to come through. So Pierce performs at the Gilded Cage throughout most of the 1960s, and his run ends 2 weeks before Stonewall occurs in June of 1969. And in post-Stonewall, Pierce separates from Rio Dante and becomes a solo act, and his career post-1969, post the Gilded Cage, really just blossoms and takes off. He hires and secures professional management for the first time, which during the gay liberation movement, which we typically refer to as the period after Stonewall, he's able to move into mainstream media. So instead of just performing in nightclubs, whether they be straight or gay nightclubs, he starts in the 1970s appearing in television. He was on Wonder Woman, Laverne and Shirley, and also was in a film written and directed by Joan Rivers, where he impersonated the Queen of England. So the 1970s is a period of great career expansion for Charles Pierce. He also performed several times in Vegas, at least once as the opening act for Margret, an extremely well-known entertainer of the 20th century. And you can see Charles dressed in men's clothing here in front of the marquee at Caesar's Palace when he was the opening act for Margret. So by the late 1970s, Pierce is photographed by Richard Avedon for Vogue in this spread that you see here, where he is really just using facial expression and mannerism to communicate his impression with the same makeup and same hair. This is him doing Tallulah Bankhead on the left, Bette Davis here on the top right, and Joan Crawford on the bottom right. Women's Wear Daily by the late 1970s refers to Charles Pierce as the doyen of female impersonators. He wins an Obie Award for his performances in New York. The Obie is given for off-Broadway performances. And again, he just has this incredible period, particularly in the 1970s, of career expansion and exposure. So by this time, by the late 70s and then going into the 80s, Pierce's act developed a very kind of specific cadence. He would open his show with a section that he referred to as the Blondes, where he would do quick fire impressions of various blonde actresses and performers like Carol Channing, Marilyn Monroe, Judy Holliday. And during this segment of the Blondes, he wore what he referred to as his glamour dress. It was how he opened the show, and then he also returned to a glamour dress for closing the show. And then in between, he did the fully costumed impressions of people like Katharine Hepburn, Mae West, Betty Davis, etc. So this is Pierce in a typical glamour dress, in a couple different typical glamour dresses that he would have worn to open or close his show, again, by the late 70s and into the 1980s. And this research benefited greatly from the very gracious input of ARLEY Berryhill. ARLEY Berryhill was a costume designer that Pierce worked with in the 1980s. By the late 70s and into the 1980s, Pierce was earning a substantial living. He moved from putting together his outfits like he did early on at the Gilded Cage from secondhand finds into having all of his costumes custom made. And this is an example that you see here of an ensemble that ARLEY Berryhill designed. This is his sketch on the right-hand side, along with original fabric sample. An image of Pierce, obviously, in the costume. And this particular ensemble featured this opera coat, this long evening coat, that was reinforced and opened up and held its shape with illuminated lights that then lit in sequence. So he would come onto stage in the dark with just a spotlight and open up the cape, and it would come on and be illuminated. So this is an example of a gown that was made by Berryhill. Berryhill talked to me about how seriously Pierce took his performances, that when they met for fittings, he was already wearing his foundation garments, that he would put on makeup as a part of the fitting process sometimes. Berryhill thought as a way for him to feel more in the character of putting on his alter ego, which Pierce referred to as being a woman. Here's another example of, this dress is very similar to this one, just done in a different color scheme, but this is an example of another Berryhill design for Pierce. That he wore many times in the 1980s for performances. And on this particular occasion, Lucille Ball came to the show and came to visit backstage. Pierce's shows were well attended by many celebrities for decades. He performed regularly in nightclubs in New York, in San Francisco, and many times abroad, particularly in London. So let's take a look at a few of the surviving costumes that are at the One archives. This particular example is a large, voluminous, claret colored caftan-type garment that he used for an impression of Katharine Hepburn, specifically her role from the 1968 film The Lion in Winter, where she portrayed Eleanor of Aquitaine. So in that film, she wore a very typical medieval dress, which included this wimple, this head covering that you see Pierce wearing here, as well as this voluminous garment, sometimes referred to as a coat or a surcoat. This example was made from a synthetic blend fabric. Many of the interior seams were finished in bias tape. There is a zipper that extends from the very top of the neck almost all the way down to the bottom of the back of the garment, and it has a small train as well. It was really interesting to see inside the train where it had been ripped and torn, but then repaired with patches on the inside at various times, and the hem was reinforced all the way around with a rather large strip of bias tape. This necklace as well was permanently stitched to the costume with heavy, thick black thread. This is another example of a surviving costume that was used by Pierce to do an impression, again, of Katharine Hepburn, this time based on her performance in the film The African Queen, where she wore this duster coat. And duster coats were typical garments that were typically made of linen or cotton and long, that women wore for traveling in the early part of the 20th century, particularly originally when riding in cars, because it was dusty to ride in the car since a lot of the car was open to the elements. So in this film, The African Queen, Katharine Hepburn can be seen in a duster coat. So this is an example of Pierce's costume that he had made to imitate that. These costumes that survive at the one archive, by the way, we don't know who the maker is of these costumes. They were not made by ARLEY Berryhill. But this duster coat has a faux panel that's inserted at the top to make it look like it was actually a shirtwaist underneath, and then is secured with a huge long strip of Velcro here at the center front. So Pierce often had to change very quickly off stage. So his costumes had to be able to get into and out of very, very quickly. The costume was completed with a plastic cameo pin that was permanently attached at the neckline, and this lovely Lily Daché hat, actually, that has these iridescent sequins on it, along with a headscarf with a faux rose. And then one last costume I'll show you from the One Archives is very similar to the Katharine Hepburn Eleanor of Aquitaine costume in terms of silhouette, but decorated differently and in a slightly different color. This one is more of a plum color. He wore this caftan-like garment as part of his routine that he referred to as the Turban Ladies. He was inspired by the Norma Desmond character portrayed by Gloria Swanson in the film Sunset Boulevard, but then he also did quick fire impressions of other women who had worn turbans famously in films as a part of this routine. This is me holding one of the headpieces that remains that matched this particular costume that's at the One Archive. You can see that the earrings here, right here, are actually permanently attached to this headpiece. So he just had to put it on his head and be ready to go and step into the costume. By the mid-1990s, Pierce had decided to stop performing as much as he did, although he said he wasn't retiring, he was abdicating. In his post-career time, in his abdication, he spent a great deal of time with his very best friend and bosom buddy, Bea Arthur, the famous actress, comedian, singer. These are images of Pierce with Bea both dressed as Norma Desmond on the left, and then Bea visiting him backstage after one of his performances. Pierce passed away in 1999 from prostate cancer. So if you'd like to learn more about Charles Pierce, you can read my publication, Fashioning a Male Actress, Charles Pierce, available in Dress, the Journal of the Costume Society of America. And again, I'd like to send special thanks to the teams at the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives, the Billy Rose Theater Division of the New York Library for the Performing Arts. Also, I'm very grateful for the oral history that's at Southern Methodist University. And again, huge thank you to ARLEY Berryhill.